Yo, it's Renon, and we're going to talk about the new class Glaivier, not Glaivier like I pronounced it in another video. Some of you probably know the class as Lancemaster from other regions, and we're going to talk about the class's design as well as how to properly gear it. It's the type of class where being loaded up on caffeine and G Fuel might allow you to explode that damage meter. As you can guess, Lancemaster is a super fast APM class because you switch between two stances that give you a varying buff depending on how fast you fill up your gauge before switching to the opposite stance. The class is one that is fast and rewarding but can cause frustration as well. If the boss moves out of the way during your buff window, you might get a bit annoyed. There are also two class engravings which require either high specialization, which you would think would be a lot slower of a playstyle, but the Glaivier stance buff gives you 20% more attack and movement speed, so it actually feels pretty fluid. The other class engraving wants swiftness, meaning you will still be very fast, but you can't change stances anymore, which means that you can't get the 20% attack and movement speed buff. It's kind of like cutting off one of your arms in order to be aerodynamic. If that sounds like something you'd want to do, then maybe look into the control engraving. The great thing about this class as well is that both class engravings seem to be performing well, so you can change up your build and style with the class and still be very effective. If you're a person that likes high uptime, lots of abilities, at least in terms of Lost Ark, and a high risk, high reward playstyle revolving around buff windows, then this class will probably be for you. This class really makes you feel like you're always engaged, as you have two stances, meaning you have a lot of abilities to spam and you're not really stuck auto-attacking like a class like War Dancer. On the flip side, some people might find being on a timer when switching stances to be either annoying or stressful. Hopefully this introduction gives you a feeling of what the class would be like to play. But now let's talk about the actual class guide portion. We're going to give the full rundown. How top Korean players itemize, prioritize their stats, gem, and more. So let's get right into it. First up, let's talk about the class engravings more in depth for the Glaivier. The first is Pinnacle, which gives you an enhanced buff when switching stances after fully building your meter. This is the go-to class engraving and is used more often than its counterpart. If you are a person whose EP grows with every MVP screen, you might want to play this class engraving as your chances will be a bit better. The other engraving is called Control, where this spec is kind of one-dimensional and you can only use your blue stance. Now we could talk about the non-class engravings and find out which engravings are good for both Pinnacle and Control. Starting off with Pinnacle, I'm kind of excited because my broke self invested in Increased Mass and Grudge, which are both very good for this class. However, early game you'll want some bread and butter and non-committal engravings like Adrenaline and Ambush Master. The OP late game engravings like Grudge, Cursed Doll, and Keen Blunt Weapon are not what you want unless you have high item level and can reach level 3 in each engraving. Keen Blunt Weapon is practically a DPS loss unless you have around 60% crit, so be careful of that. However, once you hit late game, you'll want Grudge, Cursed Doll, Keen Blunt, your class engraving, and Increased Mass all at level 3. And yes, you will want Increased Mass and Cursed Doll even if they stack multiplicatively instead of additively, which means they're kind of less effective, but it's still theorized to be the best two engravings for your class as well. Also, a quick note is that you'll want Increased Mass as your last level 3 engraving in the late game. Another idea is to switch out Cursed Doll or Increased Mass with Ambush Master. However, this really changes the skill ceiling and annoyance factor of the class, so I am personally not going to go with this engraving. The final engraving kind of fluctuates in what top Korean players prefer. Some use level 1 Raid Captain, or you will get a defensive engraving or maybe even Adrenaline. It's really up to you to decide what you want for your last engraving. For the Control engraving, the early game will be the same as with most classes. You will get your class engraving to level 3, followed by any of the following. Late game, from the Korean leaderboards, it feels like people who play this engraving spent some cash to boost up their item level, but didn't figure out what engravings are the best for this class. However, I'm going to try to break down some of the patterns I saw in engraving choice from the top Control Glaiviers. For level 3 engravings, you'll want your class engraving, Grudge, Cursed Doll, Ambush Master, Raid Captain, Spirit Absorption, or Keen Blunt Weapon. Priority going to your class engraving, Grudge, and Cursed Doll, and probably Ambush Master. Raid Captain and Spirit Absorption are two that kind of fluctuate between players, and you can choose which one you want. And for your final engraving, which will be your level 2 engraving, you can either get a defensive engraving, level 2 Adrenaline, or maybe even get a level 2 raid captain. It's all up to you and personal preference. Okay, now that we talked about the engravings, we can talk about the actual builds for each class. We're going to start by talking about Pinnacle, the engraving that I will play. For this build, the majority get these abilities here, which of course have names that will be changed on the English release, but you can at least look at the icons to see which abilities match with their English counterparts. This is also a build that prioritizes around 75% specialization and 25% crit. For this build, the last few skill points change at the end, which I will talk about in a second. But as you can see, the skills you prioritize are these here. On the Fierce Dragon Fever skill, the second tripod fluctuates from person to person, but that's one of the few deviations I see. The numbers on the right of each skill show which tripods people use on each skill, where the 3 on Fierce Dragon Fever would be the third tripod in the first row. And while we're looking at this, you can also see the gem allocation for this class engraving using damage and cooldown reduction gems on Fierce Dragon Fever, Ban Island, Yeon Island, Red Dragon, Yuseon River, and Line Window get damage gems, and Blue Dragon people allocate a CDR gem. If you run the crit instead of spec build, you should look at your tripods and use tripods that give more damage rather than crit rate on your red skills. And while the gems are pretty straightforward, the rune choice changes a lot depending on the player, so I'll give some recommendations for each skill based on my observations. Now let's talk about control. Again, you can take a look at the overall build. If you watch the Pinnacle portion, you probably understand how to read this sheet, but I will expand on it a little bit as well as explain it again for people who haven't watched my Pinnacle portion. This class engraving wants around 75% swiftness with 25% crit, where you simply get a neck with crit and swiftness, and the rest of your accessories will be swiftness. The number next to each ability shows at what level you want each skill to be at, so a 12 means that you want your ability to be at level 12. However, in the early game, like we are now with not a lot of skill points, you will instead want to get level 10 on each of your abilities that are marked as 12 in this sheet. Next, the numbers on the far right represent the tripod choice. So the 3, 1, 2 on the side would mean in the first row you would pick the third tripod, in the second row you would pick the first tripod, and so on and so forth. And for the gem portion, you can actually see which gems are allocated on each skill for the top performers of the control build. And we can now talk about runes, which people change a lot, to be honest, and I'll put different options that I saw from different top performers on each ability. For the card sets, it's the same as with other DPS. You can get the Lost One Cliff set early game and then work towards your Light of Salvation, which you'll get around 3 years down the line. Pretty simple and easy, and hopefully you are already near finishing your Lost One Cliff set at the start of this video. I'll now go over the rotation for each class engraving, but the names for each ability will again change when the class comes out for NA and EU, so don't destroy me in the comments. For Pinnacle, the idea for the Swiftness and Spec build is to use your Shackling Blue Dragon ability that gives crit rate at the start of your blue stance and use your abilities to build gauge, then swap to your red stance after getting your max gauge. However, if you realize you can't get 100% crit rate with tripods, your stance buff, then you can save Shackling Blue Dragon for your red stance. With the Swiftness and Crit build, since you lose your crit tripods in your red stance, you'll want to save Shackling Blue Dragon for your red stance because your crit stat won't be enough to fill the void of the lack of crit rate tripods on your abilities. Again, be sure to monitor how much crit you have going into your red stance to determine if you need to use your Shackling Blue Dragon ability. I will also show your skill priority in each stance when looking to build gauge or DPS dump on the boss. Maxwell has a good section on this already, so I will go ahead and show it here. Also note that you can use Shackling Blue Dragon, switch to your red stance with full gauge, and use your Awakening for big burst. Or if you have enough crit without the debuff, you can skip Shackling Blue Dragon. For the control build, you can look at this rotation to get an idea of how the class works, as well as the stagger abilities tied to the class for when you need to do a stagger check. Alright guys, I should cover everything you need to know about the Glaivier, from build, rotation, card set, etc, etc. And it did take me a lot of time to make this guide, so I really hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please remember to like, subscribe, and or comment. And I'll try to make more videos in the future. And also leave me a comment for which class you want me to make a guide for next. I have a lot of different ideas in my head of videos I want to make, but it would be helpful if somebody could tell me, what they would prefer for me to make a video about. And also, I'm really hyped for the upcoming updates, and I do plan on making Argos guides, maybe a Vulcan guide eventually when that's nearing his approach. But anyways, guys, I have a lot on my plate and I plan to make a lot more videos. But for now, that's going to be it for me today. Thank you so much for watching.